The iron anchor sat at the edge of a strip mall on Shore Drive, Virginia Beach, wedged between a 24-hour laundromat and a gas station that had been out of regular unleaded every Friday night for as long as anyone could remember. It was not the kind of place that appeared on tourist maps or restaurant reviews. It was not meant to. The sign above the door had lost its second letter sometime around 2019. So it read the IRN anchor in dull orange neon, and nobody had bothered to fix it because the people who came here did not come for the sign. They came because it was 15 minutes from Dam Neck. They came because the bartender poured heavy and asked nothing. They came because the walls had seen enough that they would never talk. The smell hit you first when you pushed through the door. Stale beer and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the wood so long it had become the wood. Underneath that, something harder to name, a particular kind of human exhaustion. The kind that lives in the shoulders of men who have been taken apart and rebuilt so many times that the seams no longer quite line up. Friday nights at the Iron Anchor smelled like that, like effort, like the aftermath of things that could not be spoken about in open air. Sarah Kovacs moved through it like water moves through rock, not fighting it, simply present, simply there. She was 32 years old, though she carried herself in a way that made age feel irrelevant. Shoulder-length brown hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, not for style, but because loose hair was a liability, a habit so deep it had followed her out of every context that originally formed it. Dark t-shirt, worn jeans, a faded apron tied at her waist with the same precision she applied to everything, two clean loops, ends tucked. Nothing dangling. Her face was the kind of face that people looked at and immediately forgot, not because it was plain, but because she had spent years making it forgettable. Neutral expression, eyes that moved without appearing to move. A stillness so complete it registered as furniture. She spoke when spoken to. Ice water, no lemon, another round for 4. You are cut off, sir, and I am not asking twice. Each sentence landed clean and final in an accent so faint it barely qualified as one. Eastern European, Eastern something. Roxanne, who worked the other section and had opinions about everyone, had spent 3 weeks trying to place it. Roxanne was 26, bottle blonde, with the specific energy of someone who processes all experience by narrating it out loud to whoever was nearby. She wiped down the bar on slow nights and said things like, she acts like she is diffusing something instead of just refilling water glasses, nodding towards Sarah. It is unsettling, you know, like she is always waiting for something to go wrong. She said this to Gareth, who managed the bar, who nodded without looking up from the inventory sheet. Gareth was 58, former Marine 2 tours. The kind of man who had learned to read people the way you learn to read weather, not because it was interesting, but because it kept you alive. He had hired Sarah Kovacs 4 months ago with no tax paperwork, no references, and no explanation for the gap in her employment history that stretched back years. What he had was the way she stood when she came in for the interview. Straight without being rigid, eyes tracking the room's exits before she sat down. Hands loose at her sides, relaxed in the way that only people with real training are relaxed because everyone else uses tension to feel safe, and she had moved past needing to. He had looked at her for 30 seconds and said, "Can you start Monday?" She had said yes. That was the entire conversation. In 4 months, she had not dropped a tray, had not forgotten an order, had not raised her voice once, even when a drunk petty officer shoved a table into her hip and laughed about it. She had looked at him with those still dark eyes until his laughter stopped, on its own, then set his check on the table and walked away. He had also noticed the way she oriented herself in any room the moment she entered it. The exit nearest the bar, the exit through the kitchen, the position of the payphone on the east wall that had not worked since 2021 but whose location she clocked every time she came on shift anyway, the way you clock the location of things whose absence does not eliminate their relevance. He noticed the way she stood when the bar was crowded, never with her back fully exposed, always with a sightline to the door. He noticed that she never carried her phone in her apron pocket where it could be grabbed, but in the inner pocket of the jacket she kept on the hook behind the bar, accessible to her and not easily accessible to anyone else. He did not say anything about any of this. In this business, you learn that some people were here to forget things, and some people were here for reasons they had not named yet, and asking about the difference was rarely useful. Sarah kept the first aid kit behind the bar, stocked better than the urgent care down the street. She checked expiration dates on the trauma dressings every Sunday morning before the bar opened. She had added items quietly without requesting reimbursement. A tourniquet in the correct size, a hemostatic bandage, nitrile gloves, the thick kind, not the cheap ones that split under pressure. She had also made Gareth a copy of the spare key to the back hallway cabinet on her second week, handing it to him without explanation while he was counting the register. He had pocketed it and said nothing. Later, he realized she had kept the original. Roxanne had noticed the first 8 editions and said that is a lot of gauze for a bar. Sarah had said, "You never know." That was all she said about it. Table 6 sat in the far corner nearest the emergency exit, which made it the preferred table for people who sat with their backs to walls. It was occupied tonight by 4 men who had clearly come from a training week that had tried to kill them and almost succeeded. Ryan Mercer was the biggest one, 6'2", perhaps 220, with the kind of build that came from years of functional use rather than vanity. Wide hands, wide shoulders, a jaw that looked like it had been carved with practical intent. He was 34 years old and looked older than that tonight. His face had the hollow-eyed flatness of a man running on accumulated sleep debt and adrenaline residue. He sat slightly forward in his chair in a way that might have looked casual to anyone not paying attention. Sarah was paying attention. She had been paying attention to Ryan Mercer since his unit started coming in 8 weeks ago. She was paying attention now because the posture was compensatory. He was bracing without knowing he was bracing. His fingernails were purple, not obviously a faint bluish cast at the nail beds, the kind that required good lighting and knowing what you were looking for. Sarah had both. Derek Thane sat to Ryan's left, quieter than the others, watchful in a way that suggested he spent more time processing than performing. He was nursing his second beer while the others were on their fourth. Brennan sat across from Derek, tall, light-haired, mostly silent, drinking with a focused efficiency that suggested purpose. She had heard him mention a phone call from home earlier when she passed with another table's order. She had not needed to hear the rest. Marcus Calloway sat at the head of the table expansively, as though the chair had been placed there specifically for him. Broad-shouldered and loud in the register of someone who had learned that volume was protective. Both arms were covered in ink that disappeared under his sleeves. A Ranger tab was tattooed on his inner left forearm in clean black letters, which meant it had been put there during a period of pride and kept there through whatever came after. He had been talking since Sarah first noticed the table stories that required hand gestures and pauses for effect. He was, in the technical sense, entertaining, but his laughter was a half-beat ahead of the humor. She noticed other things about Marcus Calloway. She had been noticing things about Marcus Calloway for 4 months. Sarah carried the next round to table 6 at 9:47. She set the bottles down with practiced economy. She did not look at Ryan Mercer when she placed his bottle. She looked at his wrist. The nail beds were darker than an hour ago. His breathing was shallow and faster than his size should require at rest. His skin had the color of something moving in the wrong direction. There was sweat at his hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. She set his bottle down and straightened. She did not change expression, but she had already completed the assessment. She knew what she was looking at. She had been watching the progression for 40 minutes with the patience of someone who understood that intervening too early was its own kind of failure. She had been watching for 8 weeks, tracking the slow deterioration of a man who did not know he was deteriorating, and she had arrived at the clinical certainty that he was moving toward a cardiac event. She did not know which Friday. She did not know which hour. She knew the direction, and she was ready. The right moment was not yet. She returned to her other tables. Marcus flagged Sarah for another round. "You are quiet tonight," he said when she came. "Working," Sarah said. "Working and quiet are not the same thing. They are for me." Ryan, rubbing the heel of his hand against his sternum in a gesture she recognized, said, "Do not take it personally, Calloway." His voice had changed in the last hour, a tightness in it that had not been there before. "No offense taken," Marcus said, grinning. "You ever smile?" Sarah looked at him for one beat. "When it is appropriate." She turned and walked back toward the bar. She set the empty bottles down and glanced at the clock. 9:53. She pulled 3 cold bottles from the cooler and placed them on her tray. She turned back toward table 6. Ryan Mercer's eyes were wrong. It happened in the space of 3 seconds. His eyes had gone slightly unfocused, not drunk unfocused, but the quality of unfocused that belonged to neural compromise, to the body's electrical system beginning to stutter. His hand slid off his bottle. He made a sound low and confused, the kind of sound that comes from somewhere below decision. "Derek Thane," said Ryan, and there was already something urgent in his voice. Ryan pitched forward. His forehead caught the edge of the table on the way down, a sharp, percussive sound that cut through the Friday noise and made 3 surrounding tables go silent in reflex. Then he hit the floor, and the chairs scraped, and someone's drink went over, and the glass broke, and Brennan was already on his feet, and Roxanne made a sound from across the room, and someone near the door said, "Oh God, call 911." Sarah was already moving. She had been moving before the glass broke. The tray was on the nearest flat surface, set down without looking, without sound. She crossed the floor in 8 steps and went to her knees beside Ryan Mercer, with the ease that comes from a body that has knelt beside men on floors and ground and rubble many times and has long since stopped requiring mental preparation. 2 fingers to the carotid artery. No pulse. She had known before she checked. The check was for the procedure, because the procedure was the scaffolding you held on to when the rest of the world was coming apart. Gareth was already on the phone, his voice controlled the way Marine voices are controlled in emergencies. Derek Thane was on the other side of Ryan, his face set, his training pulling him toward action, not knowing what action to take. Marcus Calloway had not moved from his chair. Sarah positioned Ryan flat on his back with the efficiency of someone for whom this was physical vocabulary. She swept the area with a quick visual assessment, floor clearance, head position, airway angle in under 2 seconds. Then she was already into the procedure, hands finding the correct placement with a precision that went beyond any standard training anyone in the room had ever seen. It was not the CPR from the Red Cross course. The hand placement was specific. The compression depth was specific. The rhythm was calibrated to the exact presentation in front of her, adjusted in real time with the quality of expertise that only comes from having done this in conditions where there was no room to be wrong. She reached without looking toward the nearest table, and her hand closed around a metal spoon. The technique she applied was specific to preventing a complication that happens in cardiac events with this pattern of symptoms, the kind that causes survivable arrest to become unsurvivable in 3 minutes. She had learned it in a field hospital with no electricity. She had used it 6 times since then. Every time the person on the floor was still alive afterward. She released the spoon and returned both hands to compressions. Derek said, "Ma'am, we have training, let us." "No," Sarah said. The word was quiet, absolute. "I have him." Derek stopped. Because the authority in those 3 words was not the authority of volume or rank, but of competence so complete that the body recognizes it before the mind does. At the 50-second mark, she reached back without looking, and her hand closed on ice from the nearest bucket. She wrapped it with a bar towel and applied it to the back of Ryan's neck with her left hand while her right maintained compressions without interruption. An improvised hypothermia protocol that emergency medicine knew about in theory and almost never executed in the field because there was almost never someone with both the knowledge and the manual control to execute it simultaneously. At 82 seconds, she adjusted the angle of compression by 3 degrees to account for the resistance she was meeting, a judgment made by feel by hands that had learned to read tissue response the way a musician reads a room. She brought her mouth close to Ryan's ear. She spoke 4 words barely above a breath. "Black Echo, you are not done." The sound was below the threshold of most of the room. Marcus Calloway heard every word. He heard them because he had been watching Sarah with the locked-in attention of a man waiting for something he had hoped would never come. And when you are waiting with that quality of dread, your senses sharpen without your permission. He heard the words. He knew the designation. He knew it in his bones. Every remaining shade of color left his face. He pushed his chair back, not standing, just creating 6 inches of distance. His right hand pressed flat against his thigh. Nobody in the room noticed this. Sarah noticed it. She did not look at him. At 93 seconds, Ryan Mercer gasped. It was the sound of a body that had been stopped and is restarted. His chest lurched. His eyes came open, unfocused, and terrified. "Stay down," Sarah said. "Do not try to sit up. Your heart stopped. You need to stay exactly where you are." His eyes found her face. "You are going to be fine," she said with the credibility of someone who would not say something they did not mean. The paramedics came through the door 40 seconds later. The lead paramedic saw Sarah's hands and stopped walking. "Who performed CPR?" Every person in the room pointed at her. Sarah Kovacs was already standing. She untied her apron with steady hands, no tremor, no adrenaline crash, folded it with the same precision with which she had tied it and placed it on the bar surface. She picked up her jacket from the hook behind the bar. "Ma'am, are you a medical professional? I used to be qualified for emergency response," Sarah said. "Now I serve drinks." She moved toward the door. "Wait," Derek Thane said. "Who are you? How do you know that protocol?" Sarah paused at the door. The muscle at the back of her jaw contracted, once barely visible. The only evidence of something interior that she kept behind a wall, so practiced it had become structural. She turned her head slightly, but not fully. Someone who acts, she said, when the system does not. She pushed through the door and walked into the Virginia Beach night. Her footsteps were even and unhurried. The orange neon of the broken sign fell across the parking lot. She walked through the light and into the dark beyond it and was gone. Inside the Iron Anchor, the paramedics worked over Ryan Mercer. Derek Thane stood very still, running through what he had witnessed with the methodical attention of a man whose conclusion each time he arrived at it did not fit inside any category he had available. At the table, Marcus Calloway had not moved. His hands were flat on the surface. He was looking at them with the expression of a man looking at something much farther away. He had not spoken since Sarah Kovacs knelt on the floor. He had not been able to. Black echo. He had not heard those words spoken aloud since 2017. He had spent 7 years constructing the belief that they would not be spoken again. The woman at table 6 had walked into this bar 4 months ago. Marcus Calloway had known who she was the moment she came through the door. He had said nothing. He had done nothing. He had hoped she had not recognized him in return. But Sarah Kovacs did not forget faces. She had never been able to afford to. The attending physician at Virginia Beach General was Dr. Pauline Reeves, compact and direct, 19 years in emergency medicine. She stood in the hallway outside Ryan Mercer's room at 11:45 and said it plainly. Whoever performed the intervention in the first 90 seconds saved his life. That is not a figure of speech. Without that specific technique applied at that moment, he would not have made it to the ambulance. She looked at the chart. What was used was not standard CPR. The compression pattern, the thermal management, the secondary technique. I have been in emergency medicine for 2 decades, and I have never seen that executed in the field. I have read about it in 2 military medical journals, and neither presented it as practically applicable outside a hospital with full equipment. She looked at Derek. Who was she, Derek? Thane had no answer yet. He said working on it and walked to the far end of the hallway. He started with Sarah Kovacs, which was what Gareth had given him when he called from the ambulance. He ran it through every channel available to him. Nothing came back that corresponded to a 32-year-old woman with an Eastern European accent and advanced military medical training. He expanded the search. Kovacs was a Hungarian surname. NATO alliance networks had personnel registries. He made 3 calls each to someone who owed him something or trusted him enough to move faster than standard timelines. The 3rd call put a name on the screen. Most of the file was black, not redacted in the usual sense, the kind of erasure that happens when someone with very high clearance decides that certain information should not be findable. Service history stripped to skeleton data. Unit designation present but operational records gone. What remained was a name. Helena Kovacs, NATO Tactical Medical Unit, Black Echo Division. Last recorded operational posting, Syria 2017. One word at the end of the surviving file. Sole survivor. Derek stood in the hallway at 12:30 in the morning and read that notation 3 times. Then he called Marcus Calloway. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later. He had been sitting in his truck at the pier on Atlantic Avenue in the dark. He looked when he walked through the hospital's sliding doors like a man who had been outside in weather that was not cold but felt that way. Derek turned his tablet so Marcus could see the screen. Her name is Helena Kovacs, Black Echo Division, Syria 2017. Marcus looked at the screen for a long time. I know, he said. Derek turned to look at him. I knew who she was the night she started at the bar 4 months ago. His voice was the flattest Derek had ever heard it, stripped of the performance register it normally carried. I recognized her. Derek waited. Her file says sole survivor. That is because the rest of her unit died. 3 did not. Oh. 3 survived because she kept them alive for 18 hours in a building taking direct fire with no supplies and no communication and no extraction. He stopped deciding in what order the things that needed to be said should come. The 3 she kept alive, their service numbers are coded in what is left of that file. Derek, you know those numbers. Derek looked at the coded entries. He looked at them with the attention of a man who had spent years memorizing the service numbers of people he worked alongside. He recognized them. He looked at Marcus. The numbers belonged to 3 men who had been forward-deployed SEAL personnel in March of 2017. They were at Damneck now. One of them was Ryan Mercer. Walk me through it, Derek said. Syria, what happened? Marcus pressed his back against the wall and slid down until he was sitting on the hospital floor, knees up, head back against the cinder block. The posture of a man for whom dignity had become irrelevant. March 14th, 2017. I was 24. I had come up through signals and communications before lateral transfer into the teams. That year, I was still carrying dual function on certain operations, operator in the field comms oversight on the board when the mission required it. That night, I was on the communications board, dual-hatted. It happens more than people know when operations are thin on personnel. He stopped. We had a four-person SEAL element that had gone ahead into a sector outside Deir ez-Zor. Their medical support was a NATO tactical medic attached to the operation. Helena Kovacs. I had never met her. I had her call sign and her frequency and her service number in my log, and that was the extent of what I knew about her. Another pause. The operation went wrong. The forward element took casualties. 3 critical. They were pinned in what had been a medical supply depot maybe 200 meters from an active engagement line. Helena Kovacs was with them. She activated her emergency frequency and requested extraction at 22:14 hours. The monitor down the corridor kept its rhythm. I was on the communications board. I had the signal. I received the transmission clearly. At 22:21, I received a directive from my commanding officer to close the forward frequency and redirect all communication traffic to the secondary extraction corridor. The directive came from above him. I know now the chain leads to Admiral Voss. I did not know that then. I knew I was 24 years old, and I had a direct order, and the order was structured as an operational security decision. He looked at his hands. I closed the channel. Derek said nothing. I logged it as routine frequency management. I did what I was told and told myself the way you tell yourself things when you are 24 and do not want to look at what you are doing clearly, that someone with more information had made a decision for reasons I could not access. He looked up at the ceiling. I closed the channel at 22:21. Extraction reached her position 18 hours and 7 minutes later. She had kept all 3 of them alive, alone with nothing. And nobody responded to her for 18 hours because I closed the channel and nobody else in that communications chain opened it again. The classified files Derek spent the rest of that night accessing gave the structural outline of what those 18 hours had contained. The full detail had been systematically removed from every accessible database, but the outline was enough. The medical supply depot had been a 2-story concrete structure already partially collapsed. No electricity, no running water. The ambient temperature that night had dropped to 9 degrees Celsius, and the active engagement 300 meters to the west meant the building was periodically receiving indirect fire impacts on its eastern wall. Inside this building, Helena Kovacs had arrived to find 3 SEAL operators described in the clinical language of the after-action report as follows: 1 subject with penetrating abdominal trauma and ongoing hemorrhage, 1 subject with traumatic brain injury and diminished consciousness, 1 subject with bilateral leg fractures and hypovolemic shock. The medical supplies available to her consisted of what she had been carrying on her person: 2 trauma dressings, 1 tourniquet, 1 IV line with a half-empty bag of saline, a field surgical kit sufficient for minor procedures under normal circumstances. This was not a normal circumstance. The after-action medical report buried in the classified files partially surviving even the systematic erasure contained a section titled Intervention Notes that read in part: the patient with abdominal trauma underwent emergency exploratory intervention at approximately 0100 hours using improvised sterile instruments. The patient in hypovolemic shock received direct blood transfusion from the attending medic, beginning at approximately 0300 hours, the attending medic having confirmed blood type compatibility from the patient's dog tags and her own service documentation. Direct blood transfusion from the attending medic. She had given her own blood to keep him alive while his was running out. She had done this not once but in measured intervals across multiple hours, tracking her own vitals against his, calibrating how much she could give and continue functioning, giving to the edge of that margin and then pulling back and waiting and giving again. This was the part of the document that Derek had set down and needed several minutes to process before he could continue. When the extraction team reached the building at 16:21 hours, they found Helena Kovacs performing suturing on the abdominal patient using a curved needle threaded with stripped parachute cord. The building had taken 2 direct impacts on the eastern wall in the preceding 4 hours. The ceiling of the room where she was working had partially collapsed inward. She had moved her patients twice during the night to maintain maximum protection from falling debris. All 3 patients were alive. She had not left the building. She had not stopped working. The extraction team's field report noted that the attending medic was showing signs of significant blood loss and exhaustion. It also noted that she completed the suturing procedure before accepting any medical attention for herself, and that when the team leader asked her to stop and be assessed, she had said in the words recorded verbatim in the report, "He is not stable yet." and had returned to the patient. He is not stable yet. Derek Thane had read those 4 words at 2 in the morning in a hospital hallway and had thought about them with the sustained focus of a man who had witnessed a great deal of courage and had developed through that witnessing the ability to recognize its different qualities. What he recognized in those 4 words was not the courage of adrenaline or training or the momentary override of fear. It was the courage of a decision made and held through 18 hours of cold and darkness and blood loss, in the total absence of any signal from the institution that had sent her there that she was anything other than abandoned. He looked at the door through which Sarah Kovacs had walked and thought about where that decision had been made. Not in the hospital hallway, not at the bar, not in any particular moment of crisis. But years before any of this, in the specific interior territory of a woman who had decided somewhere fundamental and irrevocable that the people in front of her were her responsibility for as long as she was alive and able to act, and that the institution's assessment of the situation was not relevant to that responsibility and had never been relevant. She knew who you were, Derek said, when she walked into the bar. Yes, she worked there for 4 months. She served you drinks. Yes, she knew. For 4 months. I told you. I recognized her the first night. If I recognized her, she recognized me. He put his hands over his face and then lowered them. She has never once looked directly at me. 4 months. She has looked at every other person in that bar. She has never looked at me. Why did you say nothing? Because I am a coward, Marcus said, and because I hoped that whatever she came there for, she would find it before I had to stand in front of it. Derek pulled a chair from the wall and sat down and looked at Marcus with the attention of a man deciding something about another person. What Marcus had done was not by formal military law prosecutable on its own. He had followed a direct order under the structure of an operation with legitimate command authority. He had been 24 years old. None of this made what had happened to Helena Kovacs any smaller. None of it returned the 18 hours she had spent alone in a collapsing building. Derek knew this. He thought Marcus knew it too, had been knowing it in the specific grinding private way for 7 years. Who gave the order, Derek said. You said the chain leads to Voss. I spent a long time trying not to know that, and then more time knowing it and not knowing what to do with it. He looked up. Admiral Voss. He signed the operational withdrawal directive. The frequency closure was a subcomponent buried in 14 pages of logistical orders. It would not have looked like anything to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. Admiral Voss. Derek turned the name over. Everyone at Dam Neck in the relevant ranks knew it. Admiral Voss was currently the senior officer on the Naval Special Warfare Combat Tactical Review Board, a respected figure with a distinguished record. He was also the person who had buried Helena Kovacs' unit, buried her file, and buried the protocol she had used tonight to keep one of his own people alive. He was sitting in a windowless room somewhere making decisions about protocols and training. He had been doing this through the 7 years during which Helena Kovacs had been a ghost in a database officially nowhere carrying what she carried alone. Derek picked up the tablet and pulled up the current membership of the board. He found what he was looking for in 40 seconds. Admiral Voss had chaired an emergency meeting earlier that same day convened specifically to address the incident at the Iron Anchor, specifically to address an unknown civilian using a classified medical protocol on an active duty SEAL. He had framed the preliminary discussion according to meeting notes Derek was now reading through channels he was not strictly authorized to use around the concept of uncontrolled dissemination of sensitive tactical medical information by parties outside the system. He was not describing a woman who had saved a life. He was describing a security problem. He was getting ahead of it. Derek set the tablet down. Stay, he said. Ryan's going to be awake in a few hours. Marcus stayed on the floor. In the operating room of memory, the scene replayed itself the way it had replayed for 7 years. A communications board, a frequency open and alive with a woman's voice requesting extraction, a directive, his hand reaching for the switch. The channel closing with a sound smaller than anything should be when what it was doing was this large. He had built a career over it layer by layer, the way you build things over things you cannot remove. He had become a good operator, a reliable teammate, a man who ran toward hard situations rather than away from them, a form of penance that did not look like penance to anyone watching. He had not told anyone. Not a commanding officer, not a chaplain, not Ryan or Derek, who would have listened without judgment. He had not told them because naming it meant it was real in the external world, and keeping it inside meant it was only real in him. And for 7 years that had seemed like a manageable arrangement. It was not a manageable arrangement. He understood that now, with the clarity that arrives when the thing you have been managing walks through a door and kneels on a floor and brings back the man beside you from 97 seconds of death. Ryan Mercer opened his eyes at 6:42. The ceiling of a hospital room is a particular ceiling. He looked at it and took inventory the way people with combat experience take inventory when they regain consciousness in unfamiliar locations systematically without panic. He was alive. His chest felt like someone had used it as a work surface. How long, he said. About 8 hours. Heart stopped for 97 seconds. Ryan absorbed this. 97 seconds was a long time. In the mathematics of cardiac arrest, 97 seconds was a number past which outcomes became complicated. He was not complicated. He was in a hospital bed with full cognitive function and a heart doing what hearts were supposed to do. The waitress, he said before Derek could answer. He had fragmented images from the floor, a face above him, brown hair, dark eyes with the quality he had registered at some point during the evening and filed without fully examining. The quality of someone present in the room and simultaneously somewhere else pulling from that other context everything she needed for the immediate one. Her name, Helena Kovacs, Derek said. She goes by Sarah. She has been working at the bar for 4 months. Before that, various names in various places, most of them near military installations, most of them within proximity of people she was looking for. Ryan looked at the ceiling. The phrase looking for was sitting in him wrong, not false, but wrong in the way you touch a healed injury and find that the healed tissue has its own memory. Black Echo, he said. Derek was quiet a moment. Then, yes, you knew the designation. I have heard it whispered. After the third drink, bad month missions that did not go right. I knew it was a unit. I did not know the details. NATO Tactical Medical Unit, Derek said. Forward operation medical support for situations where standard medics could not operate. Extreme forward positions, the situations where the usual infrastructure did not reach. He paused. They were in Syria in March of 2017. Ryan turned his head and looked at Derek. The operation in the Deir ez-Zor corridor. 14 March, a SEAL forward element went down. 3 critical casualties. Helena Kovacs was their attached medical support. The emergency channel was closed by a communications officer acting on orders from up the chain. She received no response and no extraction for 18 hours. The quality of the room's silence shifted. She kept 3 people alive, Derek said. For 18 hours, alone under fire with no supplies. Emergency surgery with improvised instruments. She used her own blood. He looked at Ryan steadily. The 3 she kept alive had their service numbers in what remains of her file. Ryan, I recognize the numbers. Ryan looked at the ceiling for a long time. He could feel what was coming. The pressure changed the particular stillness before something large. He had experienced at some point in his service history a gap in the sequence. A period of consciousness and then darkness and then waking in a different location with his life intact and a version of events already assembled. For him, the narrative smoothed and simplified into something that fit inside the available categories. He had always known the official version was not the complete version. One of those numbers is mine, he said. Yes, Derek said. The monitor kept its rhythm. The light outside was gray and flat. Who closed the channel? Ryan said. The order came from Admiral Voss. Derek said. He is currently chairing the board reviewing the 117-kilo incident. He is framing this as a security issue. And the officer who executed the order, Derek stopped. Then Marcus. Ryan Mercer closed his eyes. He lay on the bed and did something interior, some process of accounting, that required the absence of external input. Derek sat beside him and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the facts had not already said with more precision and authority than language could add. In the hallway, Marcus was still on the floor. He was thinking about a woman who had walked into a bar knowing he was in it, served him drinks for 4 months without once looking at his face, then knelt on the floor and used her knowledge and her years and her body to bring back from the edge of death the man whose survival was in a chain of causality that stretched to a decision made in a communications tent in 2017, something that she had in a very direct sense been keeping alive since before he knew he needed keeping. At 8:15, a hospital corpsman appeared at Ryan's door with a small sealed envelope. Someone left this at the front desk. Asked that it be delivered to the patient in room 314. Derek took the envelope. No return address, no name, just the room number in clean, precise handwriting, every letter fully formed and exactly where it needed to be. He opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper folded once. He unfolded it and passed it to Ryan, who read it twice and then held it on his chest. On the front, 5 words. The code never really dies. On the back, the full text of the 117 kilo protocol. Advanced cardiac life support for combat conditions. Every step laid out with the sequential precision of someone who had written field instructions before, who knew that the difference between a person surviving and not could be the difference between clear language and language that required interpretation. At the bottom, two initials, HK. Ryan held the paper and said she knew she was going to leave last night. She planned what she would leave behind. She planned what we would find and when and in what order. He looked at Derek. She has been planning this for a long time. Derek was quiet. Not the cardiac event, Ryan said. She did not plan that, but she planned her response to it. She planned what came after. He looked at the paper. She has been planning all of this for a long time. Outside the window, the gray morning shifted, not breaking into sun, but becoming more differentiated, the kind of sky that suggested the day had not yet decided what it was going to be. In room 314, Ryan Mercer held a piece of paper with two initials at the bottom and thought about a woman who had carried a protocol and a purpose through 7 years of being officially nowhere and had walked into a bar 4 months ago and waited with the patience of someone who knew beyond any doubt that the moment would come. Ryan Mercer was discharged on the third day. He walked out of Virginia Beach General under his own power. His chest still carried a deep structural soreness, the body's way of recording what had been done to it and by whom. He moved carefully, not because he was required to, but because he was, for perhaps the first time in years, paying attention to the signals his body sent him rather than overriding them on principle. He sat on the couch in his apartment and held the envelope and assembled what he knew. In order, the way he had been trained: start with confirmed facts, work outward to inference, flag the gaps. Confirmed, Sarah Kovacs had applied for the ball at the Iron Anchor 4 months ago. Gareth remembered the exact date, the 4th of July, the day after the holiday when the bar was closed, and she had knocked on the back door while he was doing inventory. He had thought it an odd day to look for work, and had thought further that someone who showed up the day after a holiday with no paperwork and no references, and a stillness that suggested she had already been working for a long time, at something she was not going to name, was exactly the kind of person he needed. Confirmed, Marcus Calloway's transfer orders to the Dam Neck unit were dated the 1st of July. 3 days. She had tracked him to Virginia Beach, confirmed his assignment, identified the bar with the highest likelihood of regular patronage by his unit, and presented herself for employment within 72 hours of his arrival. Ryan held the paper and thought about what that required. Not the logistics; those were straightforward enough for someone with Helena Kovacs' background. The interior requirement. What it cost in the daily ongoing currency of human endurance to walk into a room where Marcus Calloway was sitting and put a bottle of beer in front of him and walk away. To do that once. To do that every Friday for 4 months. To look at him with those still dark eyes and look away without expression, because expression would have been the end of everything she was building, and the building required that she remain invisible for exactly as long as was necessary. He reached for his phone and called Gareth. "The first aid manual," he said. "The one you found in the medicine cabinet." "Already pulled it," Gareth said. "This is not a first aid manual. I mean, it looks like one. But what is inside? I have been looking at it for 2 days and can only understand about a third of it. This is military-grade trauma documentation. Advanced airway management, hemorrhage control, cardiac intervention sequences. All of it annotated by hand." Her handwriting. Notes on what works under specific field conditions, what fails, adjustments for different patient profiles. There are dates on some of the margin notes. Going back years, this is not something she put together recently. "Can you bring it to me?" Gareth Burdett asked it that afternoon. A 3-inch binder with a plain gray cover, anonymous in the way that things are anonymous when someone has specifically chosen them for that quality. Inside, pages dense with information organized with the precision of someone who had spent a long time thinking about how knowledge should be structured so that it could be transmitted clearly under pressure. Tabs dividing sections. Cross-references. Hand-drawn diagrams in the margins, small and exact, the kind someone draws when the printed illustration does not capture the tactile reality of a procedure as it actually presents in the field. He read for 2 hours. What Helena Kovacs had assembled was not simply a medical reference document. It was a distillation of years of operational experience, annotated with the refinements that only come from application, from doing the thing in conditions where the cost of error is a person's life. The 117-kilo protocol was in here, fully documented, but it was one entry among many. She had been collecting and documenting and refining through years of working near military installations and bars and diners and all the unremarkable civilian infrastructure that surrounds the places where training happens. She had been doing it because she understood what the institution had demonstrated to her in March of 2017, that the knowledge lives or dies with the person who carries it, and if the person is erased, then the knowledge is erased. And she had decided in that bombed-out field hospital with the radio silent and 3 men dying in front of her that she was not going to let the knowledge be erased along with her. Ryan turned to the last page. On it, in her handwriting, a single line. This belongs to the people who need it, not to the people who buried it. He closed the binder and set it beside the envelope and looked at both of them. Then he called Derek. What Voss did not know, because there was no way for him to know, it was that the evidence submission had already been delivered before the incident at the Iron Anchor. Not that morning, not that week. The Inspector General's office had received a sealed evidence package 3 days before Ryan Mercer's heart stopped at table 6, timed with the precision that characterized everything Helena Kovacs had done for 7 years. She had not walked into the bar and improvised a plan. She had walked into the bar at the end of a sequence she had been running since 2017, and the sequence had its own momentum now independent of her moving through the institutional machinery, the way water moves through stone, not fast but certain. The submission had been the step before the bar. The right person needed to be alive and credible before the right documents arrived at the right desk. That was the order of operations. That was why she had knelt on the floor of the Iron Anchor and refused to let Ryan Mercer die, not only because she could not let a man die in front of her, though that was also true, permanently and unconditionally true, but because a living Ryan Mercer with a story was the human anchor that made the documentary evidence impossible to dismiss. She had understood this. She had built toward it. The meeting that Admiral Voss convened was held in a conference room on the 4th floor of a federal building in Norfolk, with no windows to the outside and a security clearance requirement at the door. There were 11 people in the room. Admiral Voss sat at the head of the table with the authority of a man who has occupied rooms like this one for long enough that the rooms carry his shape even when he is not in them. He was 63 years old, broad-faced, silver-haired, with a career described in official biographies, using words like distinguished and decorated and extensive. He had made decisions that had kept people alive, and decisions that had gotten people killed, and decisions that fell into the category. Most decisions in his profession fell into impossible choices made under imperfect information, with consequences that had to be lived with regardless. The decision he had made on the night of March 14, 2017, was not, in his accounting, different in kind from the other decisions of that category. It had been an operational withdrawal under pressure. The forward element had been assessed as unrecoverable. The resources required for extraction exceeded what was available. He had signed the directive and moved forward. What Voss did not examine, what he had spent 7 years not examining, was the fact that unrecoverable had been his assessment, his alone. Made in a room with imperfect information under pressure, by a man managing 17 other priorities who had looked at the situation report for one forward element and made a determination in under 2 minutes. He had been wrong. He had known this since March 15, 2017, at 16:21 hours, when the extraction team's field report came back describing what they had found in that building. He had read the report. He had authorized the redaction of its most significant contents. He had initiated the process that removed Helena Kovacs' file from standard databases. He had done all of this not because he was a monster, but because he was a man in a position of institutional power who had made a catastrophic error and had available to him the tools to ensure that the error did not define what remained of his career. He had used those tools efficiently and completely, and for 7 years they had worked, and he had built the belief, carefully, deliberately, 1 year at a time, that they would continue working indefinitely. He had not accounted for the person on the other end of that signal. His framing in this meeting was careful and legally well constructed. An unknown individual had used a classified tactical medical protocol on an active duty service member. The individual had no current military authorization. The protocol had been officially suspended pending review in 2018. The appropriate response was to identify the individual and assess the security implications. He did not say Helena Kovacs' name. He did not say Syria. He did not say 2017. He was 3/4 of the way through his presentation when the door opened. The woman who entered was from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, a commander named Reyes, accompanied by a civilian from the Inspector General's office. Commander Reyes set a sealed document case on the table and looked at Admiral Voss with the expression of someone performing an unpleasant professional function with as much precision and as little personal effect as the function allows. Admiral Voss, I need to suspend this meeting pending a formal review. The room went very quiet. the Inspector General's office has received a significant evidentiary submission. Regarding the operation designated in the submission as Deir ez-Zor, March 2017, and specifically regarding the communications directives issued during and after that operation. Voss looked at the document case. Commander Reyes opened it. Inside were documents, 350 pages organized with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this moment for a long time and had wanted when it came to be absolutely certain it could not be walked back from. The chain of command documented in full. The directive signatures. The frequency log showing the channel closure at 2221. The operational withdrawal order with Voss's signature in the position that could not be misread as anything other than what it was. The personnel records of 11 tactical medical specialists erased from military databases following operations in which command decisions had been problematic. Sworn statements from 3 of those 11 individuals who had been located and persuaded at some point in the preceding years to put on paper what had been done to them. Because Helena Kovac had found them the way she found everything, with patience and the determination of someone who had organized her entire existence around a single coherent purpose. And at the front of the submission, a single cover page. At the top, a name. At the bottom, 2 lines. These protocols were buried with the people who carried them. They should not stay buried. Neither should the people. HK. Admiral Voss looked at the cover page for a long time. Commander Reyes said, "Sir, I am going to need to ask you to remain available for formal questioning." Voss said nothing. He had underestimated her. He had made the error that powerful institutions consistently make about the people they erase. He had confused removal from the record with removal from the world. He had closed her file and believed that closed files stayed closed. He had not accounted for a person who converted erasure into fuel, who spent 7 years building the very case that would reopen what he had shut, who chose her battleground on, not as the dramatic confrontation he might have anticipated, but as a dive bar near a naval base where she served drinks in silence and waited for a Friday night that looked exactly like every other Friday night until it did not. The room held its silence around him. Ryan Mercer came to the Iron Anchor on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the night at Table 6. He sat at Table 6 and looked at the floor beside it, the specific rectangle of linoleum between the table leg and the wall where the bar's uneven lighting met the shadow cast by the emergency exit sign. The space where Helena Kovac had knelt at 9:53 on a Friday night and done what she had spent years preparing to do. There was nothing there now to distinguish it from any other section of floor. The bar had been mopped and dried, and the Friday before last was simply the Friday before last, distinguished from other Fridays only in the memories of the people who had been present. He thought about what it meant to carry something that left no mark on the surface it had happened on. Helena Kovac had been doing that for 7 years, carrying events that left no official trace, specifically and deliberately removed from every surface on which they might have been recorded. Her file had been emptied. Her service number resolved to nothing. Her name existed in one surviving document in a database that required special authorization to access, and even that document was more black ink than not. And yet here he was, alive, because of her, because of what she had carried through all of that absence and placed on the floor of a bar in Virginia Beach on an ordinary Friday night, exactly where it needed to be. He thought about what it cost, not the physical cost that had been documented, the other cost, the cost of being erased, of waking up every day in a world where the institution that had shaped you had decided that you did not, in the official record of things, exist, of living in that erasure, not as a victim, but as someone who had looked at it and decided it was the institution's problem and not hers, and that the question of what she was going to do next had nothing to do with what the institution said she was. He had known men broken by smaller things than that, men broken by the ordinary attritions of a military career, the unrecognized sacrifice, the miscredited achievement, the deployment that ended badly and the report that did not say so. He had watched the weight of institutional indifference accumulate in people he respected until it became something they could not carry, standing up. Helena Kovac had taken that weight and built a binder out of it. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the wooden plaque he had commissioned from a woodworker in Norfolk who specialized in memorial pieces for the military community. The man had asked what it was for, and Ryan had said it was for someone who had been in the right place at the right time and had made use of it. The woodworker asked no further questions. Dark walnut 3x5 clean letters routed into the surface. To the one who wasn't scheduled, but showed up anyway. Ryan set it on the table. He signaled Gareth, who came over with a small hammer and a nail, and fixed the plaque to the center of the table's surface without being asked for an explanation because he had been expecting something like this. Marcus Calloway came to the Iron Anchor the following Friday. He did not sit at table 6. He sat at the bar and ordered one beer and did not drink much of it. He and Ryan had spoken twice since the hospital conversations difficult in the specific way that necessary conversations are difficult, not because they were hostile, but because they required both men to be in the presence of something true that had no comfortable resolution. Nothing had been resolved in the way that things are resolved when the problem is a misunderstanding, because this was not a misunderstanding. It was the thing itself. The only resolution available was the one Marcus had been moving toward since the night he sat on a hospital floor and understood what Helena Kovac had done with the years that his choice had shaped. He had contacted the Judge Advocate General's Corps the week before and submitted a voluntary statement. Not because he was required to, not because he had been formally identified as a subject of the investigation, because it was the only action available to him that corresponded to the actual weight of what he had done and not done, because he had watched the woman save the life of the man he thought of as his brother with her knowledge and her body, and the 7 years she had spent converting silence and erasure into something that worked, and he had understood that the least he could do was stop being quiet about the thing he had been quiet about for 7 years. His statement was 38 pages. It named names, it provided dates. It corroborated the documentary evidence from the perspective of someone who had been inside the room where the decision was made. It was in the specific legal sense significant. The writing of it had taken him 4 days. Not because he did not know what to say, he had known what to say for 7 years with the exhausting completeness of knowledge that has nowhere to go, but because finding the flat factual language of an official statement that was also the truest account he had ever given of anything required a kind of self-exposure that did not come easily to a man who had built his identity around forward motion and performance. He had written it alone. He had submitted it without showing it to anyone first, because showing it to someone would have made it possible to walk it back, and walking it back was not available to him anymore. Not after the floor of the Iron Anchor. Not after 97 seconds. He sat at the bar and did not perform anything. He was just a man sitting in a bar on a Friday night, carrying what he carried, working out what to do with it going forward. The answer he had begun to understand was the same answer. It had always been the same answer Helena Kovac had demonstrated with 7 years of her life. You carry it forward. You do not set it down and pretend it is not there, and build things over it, and hope those things are strong enough to make it invisible. You carry it forward, and you let it shape every subsequent decision, and you make those decisions better than the ones that created the weight in the first place. That was the work. It was not finished work. It was not the kind of work that finished. He was prepared for that. Gareth refilled his water glass without comment. The investigation into Admiral Voss moved through the institutional machinery with the deliberate pace that institutional machinery employs when processing something it would, in an earlier configuration of itself, have preferred to ignore. The evidence was too substantial and too well organized to be managed quietly. The pattern of 11 personnel files, the systematic erasure of tactical medical specialists following operations in which command decisions had been problematic, was not something that could be reframed as coincidence. There were hearings, there were depositions, there were conversations in windowless rooms that were different from the conversations happening in those rooms for the 7 years prior, because now the questions were different and the people asking them had documentation, and documentation changes the acoustics of a room entirely. Admiral Voss retained counsel. The board reconvened under different chairmanship. The 117-kilo protocol was submitted for formal review, and 6 weeks after the incident at the Iron Anchor, reinstated for immediate integration into Special Operations medical training. The reinstatement document noted that the protocol had a documented operational history predating its classification, and that its continued suppression represented a training gap with direct life safety implications. At the bottom of the final page in the section reserved for acknowledging the evidentiary basis for the review, 3 words had been added by the reviewing officer, departing from the standard bureaucratic template. The words were source HK. It was the most the document would say. It was given everything the document represented and everything that had made it possible, both entirely insufficient and exactly right. Ryan read the reinstatement document in his apartment and sat with it for a while. Then he got up and took the framing materials from the closet shelf where he had put them when they arrived, because he had been waiting for the right thing to frame, and he had known without being able to specify why that it had not yet arrived. The envelope came on a Thursday morning in October. No return address, his name and his apartment number in the clean, precise handwriting he knew. He had not given anyone this address, which told him something about the depth and duration of the preparation that had gone into all of it. He opened it at his kitchen table. There was one page inside. He read it twice and then set it down and looked out the window at the Virginia Beach morning, the flat gray October light on the residential street, the oak trees dropping their leaves in the unhurried way of things that have been doing this long enough to have found their own rhythm. On the page in her handwriting, single paragraph. Some people leave the system because it failed them. Others leave because they refuse to fail it. I did not leave. I changed what I was doing inside it. 7 years is a long time to carry something. It is also exactly enough time if you use it correctly. You are alive. The protocol is reinstated. The record exists now where it cannot be closed again. That is what it was for. That is what all of it was for. You do not owe me anything. You never did. You owe it forward in the way it always works. The knowledge moves through the people willing to carry it, and it does not stop because someone tried to bury it. It does not stop. At the bottom below, two initials, a postscript. 117, Kilo is not a protocol. It is a promise. The right person at the right moment with the right knowledge. That is all it has ever been. That is enough. HK, Ryan read the postscript a third time. Then he framed the page carefully and hung it on the wall beside his Purple Heart and his Navy Cross. He stepped back and looked at all three. The medals had been there for years. They represented the institution's accounting of what his service had cost and produced rendered in metal and ribbon in formal language. They were real. They meant something. The frame beside them held something the medals did not, the record of a debt that could not be rendered in metal, owed to someone the institution had erased, paid forward into the future by everyone who would now be trained in what she knew. He had an afternoon meeting with the new curriculum committee. The 117 Kilo protocol was on the agenda. It would be discussed in the language of institutional process training, gaps and integration timelines and assessment metrics, and that language was necessary, and he would use it because the work lived inside the institution, whether the institution deserved it or not, and the work was what mattered. He picked up his jacket. At the Iron Anchor, Gareth had opened the bar one Tuesday morning, 3 weeks earlier, and found the medicine cabinet restocked overnight. The door showed no damage. The lock was intact. Gareth had looked at it for a long moment and thought about the copy of the spare key that Sarah had made on her second week and kept without comment. He understood standing there in the back hallway that she had held on to it for exactly this purpose, not to take anything out but to leave something behind on her own terms at the time of her own choosing. Inside the cabinet, everything supplemented with the same precision she had always brought to it. A second tourniquet beside the first. A folded card with emergency airway management steps printed in clean, small, text laminated for durability, the kind of lamination that said this was meant to survive rough handling. On the back of the card in handwriting, Gareth recognized a single line, "For whoever needs it next." He took the card to the bar and pinned it to the bulletin board behind the register alongside the photographs of local service members. He straightened it so it hung level. He stood back and looked at it for a long moment, and then he went back to work because that was what there was to do. Roxanne came in at noon and stopped when she saw the card. "She came back," Roxanne said. Apparently, Gareth said, "She did not have to do that." "No," Gareth said, "she did not." Roxanne stood there without speaking, which was unusual enough for her that Gareth noted it. Then she said quietly and without her usual affect, "I said she was cold. I said she was strange. All those months." She looked at Gareth. "I did not know what I was looking at." Gareth took a glass from the rack and began polishing it. "Most of the time," he said, "you do not. That is not something to be ashamed of." That evening, the Friday crowd filled the tables. At table 6, a young petty officer sat down with his beer and read the plaque and looked up at Roxanne when she came by. "What is that about?" he asked. Roxanne looked at the plaque. She had her answer ready, had been working on it since the night it happened, in the way that people work on answers to questions they know are coming, because the story had a weight to it that demanded a version that could be handed to someone who had not been there. Someone who knew what to do, she said when nobody else did. "She worked here. She used to," Roxanne said. "She finished what she came to do, and then she left." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they sense something larger behind simple words and choose to sit with that rather than push past it. Behind the register, the laminated card hung level on the bulletin board. The front face held the clean sequential steps of a protocol that was no longer buried. The back held 7 words in handwriting that Gareth had stopped needing to read because he already knew them. "When seconds count rank is just noise." Gareth locked the front door of the Iron Anchor at 2 in the morning the way he had locked it every Friday for 11 years. The deadbolt, the chain, the check of the handle. He stood for a moment in the empty bar with the lights half down, the way bars look when the people have gone and the space reverts to itself. He looked at the bulletin board. He looked at the photographs of faces that had sat at these tables over the years, men and women who had come through this door carrying the specific weight of people who do their work in the hardest places and live afterward with what that costs. Some of those faces were still at Dam Neck. Some had transferred. Some had not come back. He knew which ones were which and did not look at those photographs any differently than the others. They had all been here. They had all been part of the accumulation of presence that made this place what it was. Somewhere you could set the weight down for a few hours, where nobody asked the questions that could not be answered, where the walls held what they held and said nothing about it. He looked at the laminated card. He thought about Sarah Kovacs, the way she had moved through this space for 4 months, quiet and precise, and present in the way that only people who have survived something significant are present, not partially, not with reservation, but fully, because they have been in the places where partial attention costs lives, and they have not been able to unlearn that. He had given her a while and watched her work and added to his private accounting week by week the evidence of who she was. The tray that never dropped, the order never forgotten. The first aid kit always exactly right. He turned off the remaining lights. He walked through this kitchen and out the back door and locked it behind him. In the parking lot, the October air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that arrives in Virginia Beach in late autumn and reminds you that the season has shifted. He stood for a moment and looked up at the sky, the particular dark of a coastal sky, with cloud cover, the reflected light of the city making the clouds luminous from below. Somewhere in that dark, Helena Kovacs was moving through whatever life she had chosen for this next part. He did not know what that looked like. He hoped it looked like rest. He hoped it looked like someone who had finished carrying something very heavy over a very long distance and had set it down in the right place and was now, for the first time in years, moving with her hands free. He walked to his truck. Outside, Virginia Beach moved through its Friday night. The laundromat next door ran its machines through the dark with the indifferent persistence of machines. The gas station's lights were on. The orange neon of the broken sign threw its incomplete light across the parking lot and the ordinary American night beyond, and somewhere in that night, Helena Kovacs was living forward into whatever came next. The file that bore her name was no longer the final word on who she was. The protocol she had carried through 7 years of silence was in the curriculum now, in the hands of people who would carry it forward into buildings and field hospitals, and the particular darkness of situations where the radio goes silent and someone has to know what to do. Those people would learn a protocol, and they would not know her name, and they would not need to, because the knowledge did not require attribution to function. The knowledge only required carriers. She had made sure there would be carriers. She had made sure of everything with the patient precision of someone who had understood in a bombed-out medical depot in Syria in 2017 that the most important thing she could do with whatever remained of her life was ensure that her knowledge outlasted her erasure. She had done that, not with weapons or confrontation or the loud machinery of institutional grievance, but with knowledge and patience and the determination of someone who understood that the most durable form of power is the kind that continues working after you have left the room. At the Iron Anchor, table 6 sat in the far corner with the plaque fixed to its center. The laminated card hung level on the bulletin board. The first aid kit was stocked correctly and completely as it would be found every Sunday morning, because Sarah Kovacs had made sure of that arrangement before she left, and the arrangement was self-sustaining now, because Gareth would check it himself every Sunday, because some things, once you understand their importance, do not require reminders. The bar was dark. The bar was quiet. The bar held what it held. And somewhere in the curriculum of a training program that now included a protocol that had been classified and buried and retrieved by one person's refusal to let it stay buried, a name that was not written in any official document, was present in every procedure, in every sequence of steps that would someday be executed by someone in a dark building or a broken field hospital or the floor of some other bar, where the right person happened to be present at the right moment. The name was not written. It did not need to be. It was there in the knowledge itself, in the precision of it, in the specificity of the margin notes, in the handwritten adjustments for field conditions that no textbook had captured, because no textbook had been present in the places where those adjustments had been learned. The code never really dies. It moves through the people willing to carry it, and it does not stop.